Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowdon Deli. I'm Aaron Rand from CJAD along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette. And our guest today, Jacques Jedwab, who is the president of the Association for Canadian Studies and the Metropolis Institute. And we're here today to talk about the 30th anniversary, and it's a big deal for the past couple of weeks, of the 1995 referendum. And the reason you're here, Jack, is because back then you were involved, and we're finding out now, it's amazing, 30 years later, things that we did not know that happened back in 1995 during the referendum. I know you have some stories, so let's begin, though, with what you were doing in 95 and how you were involved, and share some of the stories if you could.
Sure. So at the time, I was executive director of the Canadian Jewish Congress Quebec region. We had entered into a coalition with the Greek and Italian Congresses a few years prior, actually in 1991, during what I suspect few of your listeners will remember was the Bélanger-Campo Commission, which was looking into the future of Quebec within Canada. And we looked at our respective submissions and realized that we're saying pretty much the same thing. We're representing largely Federalist communities. And we had some common view about how there was a lot of polarization debate. And so it was sort of played out as either English or you're French. And we didn't feel we fit into those boxes that neatly. And so we created this coalition. And that coalition sustained itself across the Charlottetown referendum and then up to the 1995 referendum, where we sort of stayed together and we became part of the No umbrella at the time. So our organization actually was the sort of secretariat which oversaw the actions of the coalition of those three groups.
Basically the ethnics.
Well, not in their entirety, but a fair chunk of what was the sort of considered the cultural communities or ethnic communities in Quebec at that time. We're about 400,000 people altogether. We're not homogenous, but the vast majority of members of our community were going to be voting no in that 1995 referendum. So we didn't need to, as some people today on the separatist side like to repeat, we didn't need to tell our communities how to vote. Nor did we tell them, vote on the basis of your ethnic origin. We never did such a thing. They had every intention of voting overwhelmingly for Quebec remaining within Canada, and we were basically reflecting that view and responding to many, many requests to explain why the members of our communities were voting that particular way.
It's interesting when we look back, and obviously 30 years is quite a while, at just how that changed from it looked like we're going to lose to it looks like we might not lose to, oh, we're not going to lose. A lot of people point out now, and I think Jean Chrétien was quoted just the other day actually, saying that, even though he had told members of his own party at the time, lay low, don't say anything, don't rock the boat, but there was a plan B if there had been a different vote.
Well, I see Mr. Chrétien saying last week that he wasn't going to accept the outcome if it were a favorable yes.
He's going to put forward another question, he said.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that's what would have happened. My sense is that had there been a narrow yes outcome, that it would have meant the failure of his government, and he probably would have had to go to an election, which was by and large what most people thought. Now, whether he was going to act in some unilateral way to propose another referendum, I didn't hear. I wasn't, in the know on that or close enough to the decision makers to be able to verify any of that. I presume there was some plan, right, based on the stuff I was hearing, but and I might have vaguely heard some reference to that, but my general sense was if there was a yes outcome, then there would have been an election. Well, now, to be fair, according to the question, the proposal to move to sovereignty would have come after they reached out to the rest of Canada to invite this partnership on an economic and political basis. So, but I understand on their end too that Mr. Parizeau, in the event of a yes, had every intention of declaring Quebec was independent right away, independent of the partnership offer built into the question. So there was a lot of that fuzziness, and that's what ended up prompting the Clarity Commission, which you may remember, to determine whether the question needs to be clear in the event of a future such consultation. I happen to have the good fortune of going first at the Clarity Commission hearing because Mr. Dion asked me to present sort of the views personally. At that point, I wasn't with the Jewish community as regards that referendum process, which I did, and I felt it was vital to have a clear question.
Yeah, well, that was the whole point. I mean, how long was that? It was one of the most long-winded questions. I mean, you didn't even know what you were supporting.
By the end, you weren't knowing what you were voting
No,
for.
exactly.
And Christian just wanted a question, yes or no, do you want to separate from Canada? And basically that's what he said his plan was. But
yeah, and we'll have to, now we're hearing all kinds of talk about questions with 3 possible options from the sovereignist side and stuff like that, which would go wildly against the sort of whole process of clarity and recognition, which would be vital in any future such consultation. Like I was in Scotland in 2014 for their referendum. Actually, I got the opportunity to be a freelancer for Bell Media, actually, when I was in Scotland to cover the referendum. I think I spoke to you probably at that time. And they negotiated with the UK to ensure that there was agreement on the question, which was a clear question.
Again, if you think back, people point to a pivotal moment in a campaign. Obviously, in the case of ends, it was when Jacques Parizeau realized, you know what, I'm not the guy, or perhaps he was told, you're not the guy. And then suddenly Lucien Bouchard gets involved, and everything begins to change. So was that for you the pivotal moment?
Yeah, that clearly was the pivotal moment for me when things started to just go wrong for us. And Lucien Bouchard was very able to sort of bridge any of the mixed identification or ambiguity people felt about their attachment to Quebec and Canada by really reinforcing the message about the partnership. Because it was that whole partnership piece and the proposal of the partnership between Quebec and the rest of Canada that ended up helping the yes side bring the undecided voters and others onto their option. And so shoring up the deficit, which was a 20-point deficit in July of that year, and narrowing it to the point where I was seeing polls from the other side that were showing them slightly ahead as we're a couple of days before the sort of finish line / voting day.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowdon Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the hub of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus Carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowdon Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowdon Delicatessen.
Jack, what I don't understand has always been support for separation has been between 30 and 35% roughly, and yet the referendum made it very close. What would happen this time around if the PQ mandates a referendum? Will it come down to that again? Will they fudge around the question? Will the numbers rise? How did it rise up so much during that period in 95 when it has always been between 30 and 35?
Again, they had a very trusted leader and a spectacular orator in Lucien Bouchard who was able to persuade all those people who were kind of, I like the idea of a sovereign Quebec, however one defines sovereignty, but I feel still that sense of attachment to Canada. And somehow Mr. Bouchard was able to represent that, and he also had his own involvement with the Bloc Québécois, and he was a previously Federalist, and so he made the switch. So a lot of his own persona and his ability to communicate effectively was what persuaded a lot of those people who wanted the sort of Quebec and Canada somehow united. What's that expression that Yvon Deschamps used to use? It's a separate Quebec and united Canada, or something along those lines. And he was able to incarnate that sort of vision of things that ended up bringing all those people on board.
Will this happen again, though?
I don't know there's another Lucien Bouchard, and I think the context has changed to a great extent, but some things have remained pretty similar. Like I look at the polls now, and I'm a polling geek, as you may know. And I just don't see much change, right? They're still at about that mid-30s. They seem to have some push in a summer poll with Léger, where he showed a spike amongst younger voters, but that seemed to drop right back in the most recent poll. So I actually look at that poll as a rogue poll, the one that had the sort of youth spike, or there's something else I'm not understanding about how they had that spike in the summer. But they've seemed to try to build on that, so you hear a lot of the sovereignists saying, oh, young people really want this. Well, actually, no, the polls are pretty much the same based on the last poll. The ethnic communities, as they like to describe them, they're pretty much where they were too. They're pretty much in the sort of 90% thereabouts range of voting no. So the sort of what's going on the ground really in terms of the polls hasn't changed much from what it looked like 30 years ago. At the front of the campaign. Can they turn all this around?
Well,
everything's
just,
possible.
That's just it, though, right? I mean, if you look at the polls, to Bill's point, the numbers have been in that same range forever.
Yeah.
So if you're Paul St. Pierre Plamondon, who I understand is going to be joining us on the corner booth in a couple of weeks, I mean, the first part of your platform is about calling a referendum. So even if the numbers are bad and you don't think you can win on that, you don't really have a choice, do you? I mean, that's the main plank of your platform.
Yeah, I don't think he has a choice. And at this point, the unpopularity of the Legault government and the Liberals kind of still a bit stagnant right now, and is such that, it's about who's best positioned to govern. Obviously, the most important plurality of Quebecers think that Mr. Plamondon's best positioned to govern, but he has that commitment to the referendum. We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah.
It's very hard to say what this election's going to look like at this stage.
If I can go back to 95 for just a second, we talked about pivotal moments. Obviously, the Lucien Bouchard moment was one of them. Then, of course, the other side points to the big rally where people came in from across Canada. That's still something I think that rubs people the wrong way, at least on the yes side. Who argue, A, that shouldn't have happened, B, that it was illegal, and C, that turned things around. What was your assessment of that?
I'm not sure it turned things around. I think there's probably some value from the standpoint of the sovereignists saying that it turned things around because they want to make the claim that it was the pivotal moment and there were spending irregularities involved in it and so forth. But I looked at the polls and, I had access to the sort of a lot of the internal polls at the time because I was on this group that was sort of a stakeholders group that gave me access to those polls, and I don't feel that particular rally turned things around in measurable way. In fact, when as I said, I had opportunities to interact with some of the PQ representatives at the time, and they're showing me polls that even after that rally, up to the last few days, it still have them ahead. But I think there is this sort of ballot box bonus thing that Mr. Parizeau once described or would refer to, where people came to the voting booth and felt that reticence at the last minute possibly that this is going to have consequences, and that may have helped move it to the other side. But I'm not sure the big rally had the impact that people pretend that it had. It may have had some small impact, but it's very uncertain.
What have we learned in this 30-year period?
I think we've learned that there's just a lot of reticence about Quebec separating from Canada, and including amongst a big percentage of francophones, whether the sovereignists recognize that or not, and they remain very reticent. And now we're in a different context where
the whole Trump with tariffs,
the Trump issue, the issue of globalization, and what that means or doesn't mean. The idea that people like Mr. Landry, Mr. Parizeau used to speak about, which is that Quebec will be a great nation amongst the other nations. We'll meet nation to nation with the leaders of other nations. Mr. Plamondon, in theory, will meet Mr. Trump as equals, nation to nation. I'm like, really? That's not serious, folks. I mean, from Mr. Trump's standpoint, he probably would see Quebec like New Jersey, right? So, New Jersey, to be fair, New Jersey's a bit bigger, right? It's in population-wise. But in terms of his worldview, he'll see Quebec as a small actor, right, in the scheme of things. So this whole idea of the nation-to-nation idea, which is really a blur for country to country, right, in this particular context, it'd be very hard to make the case that Quebec will enjoy tremendous power and tremendous respect globally and all this sort of fluff, with all due respect to those who, sincerely feel that it's important for Quebec to be a country. I don't disrespect that. If it's sincerely felt and you sort of don't feel that you have anything in common with Canada, but if you're trying to sell the idea that it's going to make Quebec tremendously powerful on the global stage in this context, that you can't be serious.
You talked to me the other day when we spoke about going back to the 95 referendums, some of the stories that you had, including one with Bernard Landry, who I'm sure people will remember. So share the story if you can, and how that came to pass.
So there's a couple of Bernard Landry stories, but let me start with one. There was this sort of interest/fixation with my organization, the Canadian Jewish Congress, and for that matter, the Greeks and Italians' involvement in the referendum campaign at the time. So about 6 months before the referendum, I get called into a meeting with Mr. Landry and with a couple of members of the Jewish community, who are voting for sovereignty. And Mr. Landry saying that our involvement in the referendum campaign, or upcoming referendum campaign, is making my two Jewish colleagues who are voting yes feel like they're not Jewish, right? Because they're sort of feeling excluded because because we are taking a position in favor of federalism, and Quebec staying within Canada, rather, and by doing that, we're sort of making them feel isolated from the community. So my answer to Mr. Landry, he wanted to know, the conclusion was, will you on that basis withdraw from the sort of process here? That was sort of his question, right? Because you're making these people feel excluded. To which my answer was, well, Bernard, I find all this quite interesting. There's a Quebec Women's Federation that's saying, in the name of all women, they're urging Quebec women to vote yes. There's the Quebec Union of Artists that, in the name of artists, is urging all artists to vote yes. In fact, all Quebecers to vote yes. I said, and there's a Teachers Federation that's saying, in the name of all teachers, they're urging that they all vote yes. So I said to him, so currently I know women who don't feel like women, right? Because they're voting no, right? But they're part of this umbrella organization that's saying all women should vote yes. I know teachers who don't feel like teachers, and I know artists who don't feel like artists, right? So if you could speak to them about not participating in the forthcoming eventual referendum, I would consider our position, on that basis. He looked at me and said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Are you serious?" And it's kind of ended at that point. We're in a democracy, and we're not going to be sort of bullied into withdrawing. And we never pretended to represent the entirety of the Jewish community in our position, but a really important majority. And so, that was a very fascinating meeting. But then, and here's the story I haven't told, which was really sort of troubled me. Closer to the referendum, as we had embarked on the campaign as part of the No Umbrella, I'm invited to a meeting with some leaders of the Jewish community. Leo Kolber, some people may know him, he's the late senator, an extraordinary person, very federalist. Former Senator Yoni Goldstein, who was the leader of the community at the time. And this meeting, where I'm invited with 3 other members of the Jewish community, which is a confidential private meeting. I figured it's a 30-year moratorium. I've given myself my own personal moratorium of 30 years to tell the story. And we're told at this meeting, and I'm being told not to say anything by my sort of patrons at the time, just because something's coming down. We don't know entirely what it is till we get there. I'm being told that Michael Hornstein, who is again the former late Michael Hornstein, who's a big benefactor, his name's on the Musée des Beaux-Arts, who's very close to the Parizeaus. He wants Leo and Yoni to convey a message to us, which is that if we continue to participate in the No campaign, there's the risk there'll be funding cuts to the Jewish General Hospital. Right? And I'm like absolutely shocked at this thing, but I'm listening to this because Leo's very federalist. So, if Leo's delivering this message, right, and Mike Hornstein, it's coming from high offices in the Parti Québécois, this message, right? If he's delivering this message, I have to take it partially seriously, right? So, but I don't say anything, and then Yoini looks at me and he says, "Jack, you haven't said anything," which is not like me, by the way, but you haven't said anything. What do you say? I say, well, it's clear. I said, next time the ransom will be higher. And so Yoni said, "I'm sorry, I'm not following." I said, "What's not to follow? If we would submit to such a thing, next time the ransom will be higher." I said, and I asked him if he could get it in writing. "Can you get this in writing?" He said, "No, we don't have it in writing." I said, "So this is kind of confidential, private bullying without sort of, and so obviously we can't submit to this stuff." But it was the most troubling moment for me in the referendum.
What was as soon as you heard that though, were you taken aback?
Yeah, well, to be fair, I was pretty angry about the whole thing, and I sort of found this tactic despicable. I couldn't go public with it because it was a confidential meeting, and plus the risk is that it was hearsay. Also today the actors are no longer with us. There are a couple who were at the meeting who are alive today, and I validated this with them to make sure my memory of this exchange was correct. But it was despicable, shameful actually.
And your sense was it came from high within the Parti Québécois?
That's what Michael Hornstein was saying, that it came from high.
The irony of this all, of course, is Jewish General is Parizeau's hospital of choice.
Right. I just thought this whole thing was like these intimidation tactics, which I didn't fully understand why. This was so important, right? That our being involved in the campaign as we were was so important. I just because we don't represent in the scheme of things a huge percentage of the vote. The PQ and the Yes Side knows full well how most of the members, the vast majority, are going to vote. It's no surprise to anyone. So when I hear from, which I do hear still 30 years later, from people telling me, well, you told the Jewish community how to vote. I did no such thing. Why would I do that? I don't need to do that, right? They tell me how to vote. No, I'm just saying, no, why would I have to do such a thing? So, I was listening to Mr. Duceppe and Madame Lapointe last week on Radio-Canada TVA, respectively, go back over this issue and again reiterate a kind of it was the Jews, Greeks, and Italians that Mr. Parizeau was upset specifically about when he referred to money and the ethnic votes. And again, Gilles Duceppe saying that, we told our communities how to vote on the basis of their ethnic identification. We did no such thing. And Madame Lapointe saying Mr. Parizeau was particularly upset at the press conference we did a week before. Right? We did a press conference a week before the Jews, Greeks, and Italians because we were concerned about all this sort of xenophobia and scapegoating. And at that press conference, she said, we told people to specifically vote to vote no. I have all the documentation. We urged people to vote according to their convictions. We were very explicit about that. We urged everyone to vote. It's a democracy, but according to your convictions. Now, we're federalists, that's true, but we didn't explicitly say that, unlike a lot of the organizations on their side, which were quite explicit in saying,
right.
Don't go out and vote according to your convictions, go out and vote. Yes. So let's be careful.
You're not preaching to a choir.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of...
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So 30 years later, this has still not gone away. They're still looking at the same blame game with respect to, as you're saying, Italians, Greeks, Jews, etc. That's not tempered at all.
No, both Madame Lapointe, who was the wife of Jacques Parizeau, and Mr. Duceppe last week repeated these things on air. I was kind of surprised by that, because part of me is kind of, why would you want to drudge this thing up 30 years later? It was a really shameful moment for the sovereignty movement in terms of what Mr. Parizeau said. I could appreciate trying to sort of, from Madame Lapointe's, Madame Parizeau / Lisette Lapointe's view, that you want to, revise this thing and put a better spin on it because it's her late husband, right? He was the premier. Right. But it was just a really ugly moment
it
for
was
the sovereignty.
Yeah.
To your point about the rents being higher, it's actually an excellent point because, as Mr. Carney is discovering now, basically you cave in on one level and then the stakes just get higher and higher and higher, and it would exactly be the case.
Right. I mean, I said, quite clear to Yoini and to Leo that, if we ever submit to this, the ransom will be higher. We cannot submit to something less than a democracy, and if this thing were put in writing, it would be an extremely serious blemish on the sovereignty movement.
As Carney is discovering dealing with Trump and tariffs.
Jack, we're going to have to wrap up. I want you to tell the story, though. You said you had a couple of Bernard Laundrie stories. Tell them about the bet, our audience, that you had with Bernard Laundrie.
So back in 1992, prior to the Charlottetown referendum, I try to talk about these things to my kids. Incidentally, Charlottetown meets you like, what are you talking about? So these are very distant sort of memories in our constitutional history. But Mr. Laundrie would visit several of the communities, minority communities, and he'd come to the Canadian Jewish Congress, and he often reached out to me, so I had several meetings with him. And so prior to the Charlottetown referendum, about 6 weeks before, he calls me and he says, and we get into this conversation, Jack, do you really think that the yes can win the Charlottetown referendum? And we're on the yes side, our organization with others. And I say, Bernard, there's still 6 weeks left of the campaign. Mr. Barassa, our premier, has often said in politics 6 months is an eternity. So we got 6 weeks. Maybe we can overcome the 20 deficit.
Just so you explain to people who don't know, so you're talking about a different generation. The Charlottetown, explain what that was about at the time.
So the Charlottetown referendum was after the failure of what was the Meech Lake Accord to recognize Quebec's as a distinct society. And the crisis that created when it failed, this effort to sort of get reconciliation of Quebec with the Constitution. There was a referendum put to the entire country, Charlottetown, based on an accord struck in PEI that recognized Quebec as a distinct society. And the idea was, we can get this referendum passed, then we can effect reconciliation with Quebec. But it wasn't going to succeed, and particularly in Quebec, and for that matter, in many other parts of the country. And so there's a 20-point deficit nationally with respect to its adoption. So
that's what the bet was on.
So the bet was on that. And so a 20-point deficit. Mr. Laundrie is sort of on the no side. He wants the Charlottetown Accord rejected. and he's challenging me to this wager, which I know is a losing proposition because we're down 20 points. But I had to accept the bet because I felt very intimidated on the call, right, by Mr. Laundrie trying to get me to admit that it was a losing cause, right? So I took the bet, which is a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne. Now,
A big one.
right, full disclosure.
Full-size one.
I'm a kosher wine drinker at best, right? So that, my familiarity with the vineyard does not include Dom Perignon, though I've heard of it before, right? I go immediately to the then SAQ or liquor board and I buy the bottle. It's like in the $120, about that amount, right? So because I figured this is a lost bet, right? I'm going to just do what I need to do and send it to him like right after the referendum, which I did. I then see him because still see him reasonably frequently. I run into him at July 4th at the birthday bash at the American Consulate, which is held annually. This is July 4th, 1995. We start a conversation. There are a bunch of people around. It's not on the phone, it's in person. And he says, Jack, this is the year, in the fall or thereafter, we're going to have our referendum. We're going to win. Quebec will be a nation, and you and I, side by side, will be working towards building the nation together. So I said, geez, I see you're very optimistic, Bernard. Would you like to place a wager? And he says, well, what do you have in mind? I said, 2 bottles of Dom Perignon champagne.
Of course.
Right? So it's double or nothing, And I think at this point I've got him, to be fair, because, we're up 20 points. So I did watch with a bit of trepidation, not only about the future of the country, but I also knew I had that other thing in the back of my mind, And as we know the results, the no wins narrowly, right? And
you're waiting for your champagne.
I'm waiting for my champagne, to be fair. I wait a few weeks, nothing happens. Another couple of weeks go by. I decide I'm going to reach out to collect my wager, right? It is what it is. So I call Bernard Laundrie's chief of staff. Now remember, there are, despite all the theater of the sort of adversaries at each other's throats, there are lots of relationships and friendships across those lines. So I call his chief of staff, Pierre Boileau. I say, Pierre, listen, I know it's a little sad on your end, and I've seen some of our mutual friends. I was at TVA on the night of the referendum. I saw some of my sovereignist friends were crying, and I'm empathetic. Your dream's been busted, and I'm not insensitive to that. Having said that, I've called you because I have a bet. I bet your boss 2 bottles of Dom Perignon champagne. I pay my bets. I expect my bets to be paid. And within a matter of days, I did get the 2 bottles of Dom Perignon champagne with a letter saying that he wanted to do a wager eventually on the 3rd referendum, which, regrettably, he passed away, and so.
And you still have one of those bottles, and you brought it here today for us to drink.
That's right.
No, I have one of those bottles. It's at my house, and in future, I would invite you if you'd like to come over. I hope on air that this isn't inviting a whole range of people to come over, but I have one of those bottles.
Well, who knows? We might get a 3rd referendum. If that's the case, hang on to that bottle.
Yeah.
You're going to make another bet?
I've been reluctant to tell this story 30 years later because it looks like I bet on Canada. And I did bet on Canada.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it just looks like I'm betting, like physics. It's like it has a dollar value bet. So that was the sort of reticence about telling the story. But please don't judge me. Everyone, 30 years later, I thought it was a funny story to share.
Yeah,
I think it is too. Jack, I want to thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks,
My
Jack.
pleasure.
That wraps up this edition of the Corner Booth Podcast. We'll see you again soon.